Okay, guys, so here is chapter 18. Chapter 18 is all about evolution and the origin of species. This is kind of an overview chapter, and then in chapter 19, we'll get a little bit more specific. So to start off, you guys probably know this, but the theory of evolution is a cornerstone unifying concept in biology. And so as scientists, we, based on facts, know that all species evolved at some point from pre-existing species, and that evolution is continuous. It's still continuing right now. And we actually have scientists that are measuring evolution, which is not an easy task to do, but there are some videos that show you some work of some scientists actually doing this work. And there is a common ancestor to all living organisms that have been present on the planet in the past or are still present on the planet today. And so all living things evolved from one common ancestor. There's a famous quote that says, "Nothing makes sense in biology except in the light of evolution." And so, we've done genetics thus far. Let's look just at that. We said that DNA, right, structure, DNA replication, transcription, translation. If we look at any organism on the planet and we look at how those processes are done, or what the genetic code is, it's pretty much the same. It's conserved from bacteria all the way up to very complex organisms like us, humans. And so that wouldn't make sense except in light of evolution. All living things on the planet have evolved from pre-existing species, and so we are all related. So what is evolution? Evolution is the accumulation of genetic changes within a population over time. It's really important that we understand what a population is, because evolution occurs at the level of populations. We don't say that individuals are evolving. So you and I are not evolving on our own, but as a population, maybe as a human population, we are evolving collectively. So what is a population? That's going to be a group of individuals that all belong to the same species that live in the same region at the same time. Okay, and with evolution, what could happen is if you have this population that for some reason diverges into two, whether they get physically separated from each other or some other mechanism is at play. If you have one population that divides into two and they accumulate enough genetic changes where they're not going to be able to reproduce anymore with each other, then we would say that they have become two reproductively isolated populations and therefore two different species. Okay, so what is a species? I want to make sure you know the definition of this as well. A species is going to be a group of very similar organisms. They're going to have a lot of similarities. So they're going to have similar morphology, body shape, similar metabolism, similar chemical reactions that are taking place inside of their bodies. Most importantly, organisms that belong to the same species are going to be able to reproduce in nature to make fertile, viable offspring. Okay, so if you're of the same species, you have to be able to breed to produce offspring that live. So viable means to live, and fertile means that they could then reproduce themselves. Okay. And evolution happens really on two scales. There's microevolution and there's macroevolution. And as the name implies, micro means small and macro means large. And so microevolution are small evolutionary changes. So maybe over just a few generations, differences in allele frequencies in a gene pool, which we're going to talk about in the next chapter. That would be microevolution. Macroevolution is going to be larger scale evolutionary processes, like the evolution of a new species or the evolution of a new taxon higher than that, so maybe a new phylum or a new class. Okay, that would be macroevolution, large scale changes. So the next slide here. So I want to give you the history of how this theory of evolution really came to be. And so we're talking about the mid-1800s when we start to talk about this theory coming to light. Prior to the mid-1800s, the prevailing theory of that time was really built in religion. And so what scientists or non-scientists believe in those days was that each species was created by a higher being, so God, and that they stayed unchanged throughout time. And so each species, so humans, for example, were created by this higher being, and that they did not evolve from anything else. Okay? What also was believed at that time was that the earth was relatively young. And so if the earth was relatively young, then the organisms on the planet didn't have enough time to evolve from pre-existing organisms. So that was the prevailing thought in the mid-1800s. And then Darwin came along. And Darwin really went up against this theory. And Darwin gets credit for being the father of evolution, but really there was a lot of things before the mid-1800s. A lot of scientists that actually helped Darwin in making his theory. None of these people came up with the mechanism that Darwin had. However, they all kind of added to it. And so way back, if we look at Aristotle, so Aristotle lived from 384 to 322 BCE. Again, he didn't suggest the theory of evolution, but he actually wrote about how organisms, if we look at different organisms, different species, that there was very simple species, and then there was more complex organisms. And he kind of put them into like an order from least complex to most complex. And what he stated was that he thought that organisms were moving toward a more perfect state. And he didn't have a mechanism for that. Okay, but again, he started to allude to this theory of evolution. And one thing that I do want to point out, as Aristotle said, more perfect state, that's a really common misconception that students have, that evolution happens or it's driven to make organisms more perfect. And so we're going to kind of debunk that a little bit later on. It's not really evolving to a more perfect state. It's evolving to the best suited state for that particular environment. It's really the environment that's going to drive evolution. Okay, it's not that we're trying to become more perfect. Okay, and then who else? So Leonardo da Vinci was considered to be the first person who was able to correctly interpret fossils. And so before him, nobody really knew what a fossil was. And he said that fossils are remnants, the remains of organisms that once existed. Okay, and many fossils come from those organisms that have become extinct, that are no longer on our planet. He lived way back from 1452 to 1519. So again, much earlier than the 1800s. And then there was Lamarck. And so you've probably all heard this story. Lamarck lived from 1744 to 1829. He got kind of close, but he didn't get it right perfectly. So Lamarck is known for studying giraffes. So what he did is he looked at giraffes, and particularly he was looking at neck length. And what he found is that giraffes, with shorter necks would eat plant matter that was lower on trees, and giraffes that had longer necks would eat plant matter that was higher on trees. And what he said was that if there was not a lot of vegetation that was kind of low-lying on trees, that giraffes were able to grow their necks, extend their necks to reach that higher vegetation, and then that acquired trait, the longer neck, was able to be passed down to their offspring. And so the mistake that Lamarck made was that organisms can actually acquire these traits during their lifetime, and then they could pass them on to their offspring. And we know now that that's not true, that in order for a trait to be passed from parent to offspring, it has to be genetic in nature. It can't be due to, extension of muscles or anything that Lamarck tried to say could happen. So again, untrue but helpful to Darwin. So he understood this whole transmission of something, traits. Okay, they didn't call them traits then, but he didn't get it perfect. Okay, so who else helped him? Lyell lived around the time of Darwin. He was actually a friend to Darwin, Charles Lyell. And Lyell luckily said that, you know what? The Earth is much older than people think it is. And so if the Earth is much older and it's been around for a lot longer than we previously thought, then there probably was enough time for evolution to occur. Okay? And another scientist who also wrote a book called James Hutton, he also proposed that the Earth has changed over time. And Lyell reported that as well. So if the Earth is old and the Earth has changed over time, then organisms may have been on this Earth a lot longer than previously existed. And with that time, and since the Earth changed, why couldn't species change? Okay, so that's kind of where we're going with this. And so, oh, my website down here is cut off. And so here's Charles Darwin. Okay, right here, this picture is Darwin. And you've probably all heard of Charles Darwin. He kind of gets most of the credit for coming up with the mechanism of evolution, which we're going to get into in more detail. His mechanism was called natural selection. So when you think of evolution, I want you to think natural selection. There was actually another scientist who was also studying this around the same time as Darwin, a little bit after Darwin made his discoveries. He was much younger than Darwin, and Darwin was considered to be, the expert in all things evolution, and Wallace was more of a novice. And so Wallace actually came up with the same exact mechanism, the same exact explanation as Darwin, but Darwin didn't actually publish until Wallace was ready to get his information out there. And so again, even though Charles Darwin gets most of the credit, we consider him to be the father of evolution. Alfred Wallace actually did the same work around the same time and came up with exactly the same theory. Both of them presented together in 1858 at the Linnaean Society. Most textbooks mention Darwin, and some are finally mentioning Wallace. So I want you to pause the video here, and I want you to go in the video resources folder, and I want you to find this video. I actually gave you the YouTube link to make it easier for you. So you're going to watch, this is a video that's been produced by the Howard Hughes Medical Institution. Really great organization, puts a lot of biologically relevant resources free on the internet for us. Their biology site is called Biointeractive. And so this video is going to talk about Charles Darwin's and Alfred Wallace's really cool journey, what they found, and how that influenced our theory. When you're done, you can pick back up. Okay, so I put this in words for you just so that you have it. Again, that video hopefully provided a lot of this to you. So in 1831, Darwin got onto a ship, and that ship was a 5-year exploratory cruise. They were actually going to be making, they were charting, making maps. The ship was called the HMS Beagle. And so again, he got on it. He knew he was going to be out there for 5 years. What did he do while he was there? He was the ship's naturalist. And so even though the main mission of the ship was this charting, he was there to be the naturalist. So his job was to collect and catalog organisms. So he collected and he cataloged thousands of plants as well as animal species. He kept really good notes of his observations. He took home a bunch of finch, many different plant species. Okay, the finch are probably the most notable organism. You've all heard of Darwin's finches. You may have also heard of his tortoises, okay? The most important part of his voyage, they went all over the world, but the most important part where we really pull our information from, they went to South America, and so on the South American western coast, off that coast is the Galapagos Islands. And the Galapagos Islands are a series of little islands, so they're an archipelago. Much like Hawaii or the Malay, which you saw in the video. And what he saw when he compared these animal and plant species that he was collecting, he compared what he found on the Galapagos Islands, each island to the others, and he also compared those specimens back to the specimens that he found on the South American mainland. And he saw really distinct differences in animals. Again, particularly he was looking at reptiles, birds, tortoises, and he also looked at plants. And so again, with all of these different organisms, he really looked at morphology, calls. If we're looking at birds, how did birds call to each other? Reproduction. So he's looking at them on all of these Galapagos Islands and comparing them to the South American mainland. So here's his voyage. So here we are, South America, right? Again, all over the world, but let's focus on where we're really concerned with. So the South American mainland here, on the western coast here. So he was comparing organisms found here mainly to the organisms found here. Once we blow that up, these are the Galapagos Islands. And so all of these little islands are part of this island chain. And again, he traveled to each one of those, and he compared animal and plant species from each island to each other and to the South American mainland. And he got home in 1840. And around that same time, or a few years after he got home, Alfred Wallace, the other guy, he traveled to Brazil and the Amazon. He looked at the Amazon rainforest. He was collecting insects. He's most noted for his butterflies. And he went there again from 1848 to 1852. So he was there for quite a long time as well. He studied on the Malay Archipelago, which again is another island chain, from 1854 until 1862. So again, you saw his work in that video. So both scientists were studying similar regions. Okay, both of them were studying these island chains. So let's go to some of Darwin's work. Again, you saw a lot of this in the video, so I was trying not to repeat too much. Darwin's finches. So again, very, very notable when we talk about evolution. This is kind of the key species that's talked about, or the key group of organisms, group of species. So finches. Mainly he was looking at beak shape. And he was comparing beak shape of the mainland finch species to those finch species that were found on the different islands. And what he found was that these finch species were all very, very different from each other. Okay, and so this is straight out of your textbook. If we look at these finch here, look at their beak size. Okay, so we've got finch number 1. Here's its scientific name down here. If you look at this beak, look how large it is. And then if we look at finch 2, smaller beak, finch 3, finch 4. What he found is, these finches were found on different islands. When he looked on these different islands at what these finch were eating, the beak size and shape made sense. So these larger beaks were going to be found on finch on islands where the food source was maybe large, difficult to open seeds. Okay, and if we get down here, so this finch with a very small beak, I don't know, maybe this finch is used to eating kind of grubs that he has to pull out of trees using a little stick tool. Okay, so the beak size and the beak shape is going to match the food source that's available to that finch on the particular island in which the finch is living. There's going to be more about finch and how we think that these different beak sizes evolved over time in a video that I'm going to have you watch in just a few slides. Before we do that, I just want to give you the rest of the history here. So upon returning home, We had Darwin. He started to develop an explanation for what he saw on the South American mainland compared to what he saw on the islands. Again, he was studying Lyell's principles of geology. Again, that told him that the Earth was old and that the Earth had changed over time. He also made note of artificial selection. I'm going to show you an example of artificial selection in just a second, but you've all heard and seen this before. There have been and are still many varieties of plants and animals that are bred for particular traits. So they're artificially selected instead of the environment selecting for the traits that should be possessed by those plants and animals. Instead, humans are able to select for those plants or those animals that have specific traits in order to increase the frequency of those traits in a particular population. So let me show you this. So let me just move this down a little bit. You've probably all heard of some of these vegetables or eaten some of these vegetables that are on this slide right here. So you've all probably had Brussels sprouts, maybe you've had kale, here's cabbage, here's broccoli, my favorite. If you've ever had rapis or kohlrabi, that's what that plant looks like. All of these plants are all descendants of the wild mustard plant. And so over time, through many, many years of artificial selection in agriculture, so by farmers, we have really created, right, through artificial selection, all of these different varieties, all these different species, which again all originate back to this common ancestor. And so humans selectively bred wild mustard plants to create Brussels sprouts, again through many, many generations of selective breeding. They would choose wild mustard plants that had large axillary buds. And so when you eat a Brussels sprout, that's actually a bud, an axillary bud. Let's say, for example, for broccoli here, the wild mustard plants would be selected for flowers and stems. So short, stocky, thick stems and lots of flowers. If you look closely at broccoli, all this top structure here, this is all flowers. And so again, they were crossbred generation after generation, selecting for plants that showed those traits that the farmer wanted. That's artificial selection. And so if farmers could do it, if humans could do it, does nature do the same thing? What else did he study? He studied another man's work. His name was Thomas Malthus. Now this guy, he was not a scientist. He lived from 1766 to 1834, and he published a lot of work. But again, not a scientist. Instead, I think he was a clergyman. What he noted is that in most species, there is usually more offspring produced than could ever survive. So we call that overproduction. It's hard to kind of visualize with humans, especially in us. We live in a country where we don't usually see too much of this. But I like to think of kind of an egg mass produced by frogs. I don't know if you've ever seen frogs spawn. A mass of eggs in the water. There's hundreds of eggs all in this sac-like structure. All little fertilized eggs are inside of there. And so there are many more eggs, fertilized eggs that are produced than will ever be able to survive. And so that's called overproduction. Okay, we see that again with most species. And so Darwin suggested that in order for those organisms produced to survive, only those that have inherited the good traits favorable in that particular environment, will be able to survive. And those organisms that are produced that do not have those traits, they're not going to be able to survive. And so therefore the frequency, right, of favorable traits in a population will increase and unfavorable traits should decrease. Okay? So when we talk about favorable traits, those are called adaptations. Those are genetic. They are evolutionary modifications that are going to improve or enhance the likelihood of survival of an organism in a particular environment, and therefore increase that organism's reproductive success. So before I go any further, let me just tell you this. I want to be really clear here. When we talk about evolution, we talk about organisms that are best suited to an environment. They're going to survive, right? You probably heard the fittest, right? Evolution. Oftentimes we'll hear about survival of the fittest. So what that really means is those organisms that have the best traits for a particular environment, they're going to live. Living is not enough. Okay, so when we talk about evolution, it's really about reproductive success. So not only does that organism with the good traits have to survive, it also has to be able to put its genetic information into the next generation. Okay, so it has to be able to survive and reproduce. So when we talk about an adaptation, we're talking again about some type of a genetic modification that enhances the survival of an organism in a particular environment and enhances the reproductive success of that organism in that environment. So it's all about reproduction. Okay? Eventually, if enough modifications accumulate in a population, that might result in the evolution of a new species, which again will be on the macro level. Okay. So here we go. Natural selection. Let's really define it. So again, you have to have variation in a population. Okay? There has to be variation. Those organisms that have traits that enhance their survival and enhance their reproductive success are going to live, and they are going to put their genetic information into the next generation. As a result, the population, we say, is going to change over generations. The frequency of the favorable traits will increase, and the frequency of the less favorable traits will decrease. And so again, those traits that make that organism better suited for that particular environment, they're going to increase in frequency. And those traits that do not will decrease. So before we go any further, I want you to take a look at two other videos that are inside the video resources folder. So one of them, I think it's titled The Galapagos Finches. Again, these are both HHMI biointeractive videos. And so the first one about the Galapagos finches really takes what Darwin did and it brings it to light. So it's going to show you how those finches evolved. And the two scientists that are presently working on this, who've done a lot of work over the years, are Peter and Rosemary Grant. And so if you remember back a couple of slides ago, I told you that we're still we're following evolution even today. Evolution is still happening, and there are scientists that are studying it. These are two scientists that have been studying evolution for a very long time on the Galapagos Islands, and they're particularly looking at finches. There are other studies happening as well, so I wanted to show you one other one. Again, it's on HHMI Biointeractive, a fantastic site, especially for evolution. And this particular study studies these mice that are called rock pocket mice. And so again, take a pause here and watch those two videos. Okay, so you've watched those videos. I want you to take a little bit of time now, get your in-class assessment out, and I want you to answer these questions about evolution. Once you are finished, you can continue. So before you go on, I just have a couple of questions for you. I'm getting ahead of myself here. A couple of questions for you. So the first question, which scientific concept did both Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace independently come to or discover? Pink is mutation, blue is natural selection, green is overbreeding, and yellow is sexual reproduction. So again, what did both Darwin and Wallace independently discover? I'll give you a minute to think about that. And hopefully you answered blue, natural selection. So both scientists were trying to figure out the mechanism for evolution, and both figured out that it was natural selection.
Next question. Fitness in terms of evolution refers to, so being fit, does that mean having strength, having endurance, being reproductively successful, or having resourcefulness? And so hopefully you answered green, reproductive success. So remember, fitness in an evolutionary sense means those organisms who are best suited for that particular environment are going to make it. And more importantly, right, they're going to be able to reproduce successfully and therefore put their genes, right, their alleles, into the next generation. Okay, and so what we have is we have a change in allele frequencies over time. That's really what evolution is. Okay. So the next question, which of the following situations will lead to natural selection? So in pink, it says the seeds of two plants land near each other and one grows larger than the other. Blue, two types of fish eat the same kind of food. One is better able to gather food than the other. Green, male lions compete for the right to mate with females, with only one possible winner. In yellow, all of the above. Think about this for a few minutes. Let's go to the first one, look at that together. So we have the seeds of two plants that land near each other, and one grows larger than the other. Well, the one that's growing larger than the other may be better at doing photosynthesis, gathering sunlight and making food, right, from that sunlight, transforming energy. And if the plant is better at transforming energy, it might have a higher rate of survival, right, because it has that adaptation. But does that adaptation allow that plant to reproduce better? Maybe. Maybe the larger the plant is, the better able it is to disperse its seeds. We're not really given that indication here, so we'll think about that one. In blue, we've got two types of fish eating the same kind of food. One is better able to gather that food. So again, it's better at obtaining that type of food, so that would be an adaptation. But does that make the organism definitely more fit, but better able to reproduce? I'm not sure. And so in green here, we've got male lions compete for the right to mate with females with only one possible winner. Yeah, so the male that is able to reproduce with the female is definitely going to get its genetic characteristics into the next generation. So definitely more fit. And so natural selection, definitely in green, that will lead to natural selection. There's the possibility of both pink and blue as well. And so we've got that at the bottom that says all of the above. This is a tricky one. If you had answered all of the above, I probably would have given you credit. Green is definitely the best answer of the three that will lead to natural selection, because we know that there's reproduction involved here, right? Differential reproductive. One male is going to be better at mating with females than the others. And again, in both the pink and the blue examples here, we don't see anything about reproductive differentiation, if there's a difference in reproductive success between the plants or the fish. So again, the lions would be the best answer there. Okay, I think that's the last one. Yep, so you're going to go on to the next part. And I'll have more questions for you after the next Are You With Me?
Okay, so we've started to define evolution, but I want to make sure that we really understand all the parts and pieces to this process. And so I mentioned this before. I said that there must be variation in a population. So that's the key. That is what natural selection is acting on. There has to be variation in a population in order for natural selection to occur. And that variation has to be heritable. There has to be genetic differences amongst the individuals within a population in order for you to get changes over time. Okay? The second thing here Where do these differences come from? Where do these heritable genetic differences come from? Well, the ultimate source for all genetic differences in a population is mutations. We talked briefly about mutations back in chapter 14. We said that there's different types of mutations, right? They could be spontaneous, they can be induced, they can be from problems in DNA replication or problems in meiosis, or they can be induced. They can come from the environment, right? Exposure to something changes the DNA for some reason. And some mutations are bad, and so those will be selected against. However, some mutations are good. Some mutations can lead to new alleles, right? New variants of genes that might be beneficial in a particular environment. And so those mutations would not be selected against. Instead, they would be selected for. Okay. And again, I want to make sure that you understand this term adaptation. These are any heritable traits, so genetic traits, that are passed from parent to offspring that increase an organism's fitness. Okay, and again, we got to be careful with that term fitness. Sometimes students will hear fitness and think, strength or ability, and that's really not true. An organism's fitness really depends on the environment. It could be a multitude of different things can be considered to be fit. So those are going to be any traits that increase the likelihood of an organism's survival and reproductive success. That's how we really determine fitness. Those are called adaptations. And again, that's very specific to the local environment. If there's an environmental change, a trait that was once adaptive may not be anymore. Okay, so patterns of evolution. There's really two basic patterns that we see with evolution. Evolution can either be divergent, or on the next slide, we're going to see the opposite of that, which is convergent. So divergent evolution. This is when we have two species that evolve in diverse directions from a common point. Okay, so you have one ancestral species, and that ancestral species, based on different environmental factors, is going to diverge in two separate directions. So evolve into two different species. Okay, so here's an example. If we look at all of the flowering plants on the planet, those are called angiosperms, right? Flowering plants, if you remember back to last semester. All angiosperms on the planet have evolved from a common ancestor, right? So flowering plants didn't kind of pop up multiple times in evolutionary history. Instead, it was just once that flowering plants evolved. And now from there, many different species of flowering plants have evolved. And again, if we take a look at any flowering plant on the planet, we're going to find the same basic structures. So the anatomy is the same. We still find female reproductive parts. We still find male reproductive parts. We still find structures that are going to attract pollinators. Okay, pollen is produced in the same way. Ova are produced in the same way. So the anatomy is really the same, but how the anatomy is laid out, so the morphology, what it actually looks like, is going to be different as the result of selection, natural selection in different environments. And a lot of this is driven by the pollinators that pollinate these particular flowering plants. Okay? So we can see here, down here, these two figures showing two very different flowering plants. Okay, again, if we were to take a look at the anatomy, we would find the same basic structures, right? Flowers are reproductive structures, and so we're going to find pollen, which carries sperm, and we're going to find pistils, which carry ova. And so again, the same basic structures, but again, how they're laid out is very different. And again, this has been driven, we think, by insect pollinators, the size of the insect pollinator, how the insect pollinator actually does its job. So again, that's divergent evolution. The opposite of that is convergent evolution, and we do see this sometimes. This is when we see similar phenotypes in two very distantly related species. And so these two phenotypes that are similar, they evolved independently of each other. Okay, so again, that's called convergent evolution. So here's some examples. So let's look at flight. Okay, flight has evolved in both bats and insects. And although both of these belong to the kingdom Animalia, they are really distantly related species. What do they have in common? They both have wings. Now, their wings may not look exactly alike, but both the wings of a bat and the wings of an insect are adaptations for flight. Okay? Now, these wings, again, they don't look alike. They've evolved from very different original structures. But again, in both of these, they have the same exact function, flying. They evolved, though, independently of each other. So this is convergent evolution. Similar phenotype, wings, same job too, but they evolved in very distantly related species. Here's another example. The Arctic fox here and this Arctic bird. Okay, both of them live in similar environments, and both of them in the winter months will display a white phenotype. Okay, and why do we think that is? We think that that is to provide camouflage. So it allows both the Arctic bird and the Arctic fox to blend into the snow to avoid predation and also maybe to help them in hunting. Again, this similar phenotype, being white, evolved independently in these two species. And these two species, again, both animals, both in the kingdom Animalia, but very distantly related organisms. So that's convergent evolution, when similar phenotypes evolve into distantly related organisms. And they evolved along two very different phylogenetic lines. And so these are not organisms that converged from each other. So this white phenotype did not evolve in a common ancestor to both of these. Instead, the phenotype evolved independently. Okay, so how do we know that evolution occurs? What else do we have besides what Darwin and Wallace told us and those other scientists who added to the theory? So what other evidence is there for evolution? There's a lot. There's a vast body of scientific evidence, irrefutable scientific evidence that really supports this theory. So I'm going to just introduce you to a couple of them and just give you some examples from each. So the first is the fossil record. We'll go over that in a second. The second is comparative anatomy. We also look to embryology, biogeography, and molecular biology for evidence. So let's start with the first. This is the fossil record. And so hopefully you guys know that fossils are going to be remains from organisms that lived in the past. This is our most direct line of evidence for evolution. And what we see in the fossil record, and it doesn't matter which present day species or extinct species, if we look back in their lineage, what we find is a progression, one form changing into another. And scientists have been at this for a long time. They've been able to collect and date fossils from around the world. And our record currently of the past shows us, again, that evolution has been occurring over millions of years. Fossils can come in many different forms. So down here, when we look at hominid evolution, you can see a bunch of different skulls, right? And even a whole skeleton. So it can come in the form of bones that have been preserved throughout years. This is just an artist's rendition of horse evolution, okay, based again on the fossil record. And you've all probably seen this, right? You've seen Jurassic Park. This is an insect, mosquito, that's been preserved in amber. Okay, we've got other fossils as well. Again, here's the definition of fossils. So fossils are going to be remains or traces that are left by organisms. The best type of rock formations that show fossils are sedimentary rock formations. So this is where we find kind of the best fossils. What is sedimentary rock? It's rock that's going to form over time by the accumulation and solidification of particular matter, so particular matter of other weathered rocks. And over time, it becomes kind of these layers, and these layers are going to, if they don't get shifted, they're going to really show the progression of evolution. So the older organisms, the organisms that evolved first, should be at the bottom of these sedimentary rock formations. And as we go towards the top of these formations, we will find the most recent organisms, whether they're extinct or not. Okay, so again, if we take a look at the sedimentary rock that scientists have been looking at over the years, what we find is, again, it's towards the bottom, as long as it hasn't been disrupted, a progression from the earliest unicellular organisms to the organisms on top, which would be the most currently living organisms, those that would be living today. Scientists who are responsible for this work, studying fossils and making sense of them, they are called paleontologists. And they have named to date about 300,000 fossil species, and more fossils are being discovered every day. Okay, so not only can we dig up bones or look in sedimentary rock layers, but we can also look in other places like bogs, tar, amber. I just showed you that picture, that's tree resin, or ice. All of these can also preserve organisms, and we can also find fossils in these types of things as well. Here's an example. This isn't that long ago. I can't remember exactly when it was, but you may have read about this in the papers. The remains of a woolly mammoth was found, frozen in Siberian ice for more than 25,000 years. And it was so well preserved in that ice that parts of its DNA could be analyzed. And I think we talked about this in class. But there are actually some scientists who have thought about filling in the gaps of the woolly mammoth DNA that has been found, and actually, creating a woolly mammoth from that DNA. Again, the DNA is not perfectly intact, but these scientists believe that they could fill in the gaps with current modern day relatives of the woolly mammoth, and possibly be able to recreate that. Again, there's a huge ethical implication for that. So in order for a fossil to form well, it requires that the organism that dies, right, gets buried under conditions that slow or prevent the decay process. And so sedimentary rock is perfect for that. So the organism dies, it gets covered with all these sedimentary rock, all these particulate pieces of rock, and it gets buried, and there's really not a lot of oxygen there, and so the decay process is really, really slowed down. Again, the best organisms that are going to form fossils are going to be those that are going to be covered quickly by sedimentary rock or fine soil. Aquatic organisms tend to fossilize really well because this process does occur in those environments. What environments are not great for that? For example, organisms that live in the rainforest, and I can't remember if I put this, it might be on the next slide. Yeah, so the fossil record is kind of biased. So for example, tropical rainforest, right? Hot, humid environment, really not a lot of sedimentary rock formation happening on the rainforest floor. And so an animal dies, it falls to the rainforest floor, and guess what? It's going to be decayed. It's going to decay very quickly. It's going to be eaten by something else, or it's going to be broken down by soil bacteria, microorganisms in the soil. And so very rarely will you find fossils from organisms in the tropical rainforest. Just not a habitat that's really conducive to producing fossils. And so the fossil record tends to be biased towards aquatic organisms. So sedimentary rock formation will happen in those environments better than environments like the tropical rainforest. Okay, another reason why the fossil record is biased is because those organisms that have hard body parts, like bones or shells, they're going to tend to fossilize a lot better than an organism that is soft-bodied. So a soft-bodied organism is not going to fossilize as well as organisms that have hard calcified body parts. And in here, the picture on the right here, These are paleontologists, maybe some archaeologists too, digging at a dig site. And again, you can see the layers of sedimentary rock. Okay, and they're looking for fossils. Okay, so the fossil record is our most direct line of evidence for evolution. And although the fossil record is not complete, and although it is biased, it does provide really, really good primary evidence for evolution. There's a couple of other videos that I put on Blackboard in that video reference folder that do show some of this as well. Okay, so our second line of evidence for evolution is called comparative anatomy. And so this is looking at structures, anatomical structures in different species. And if we see homology, if we see similarities, we can then make the claim that they probably evolved from a common ancestor. So here's a great example of that. So if we look at the arm of a human, the front limb or forelimb of a dog, the wing of a bird, or the flipper of a whale, if we take a look at each of those structures, all of them are used for some form of movement, maybe not the same movement, but some form of movement. And we look specifically at the anatomy of the bone structure, and actually nerves and muscles will line up the same way. We find the same basic structures, okay? So we find this bone here is going to be homologous to this bone here in the dog, which is homologous to this bone here in the bird or bat, which is homologous to this bone here in the whale. They're not exactly identical, but they are structures that are very, very similar, so homologous. They have similar form and function. And then if we come down here, so if we look at the radius and the ulna and the human, and we compare those to the dog bones in that same location, and here, the flipper of that whale, we find the same bones. And the same thing here, we look at the joint bones there, the wrist bones, comparatively. And then if we look at these bones here and compare them, again, we find homologous structures. These are called phalanges or digit bones. We find homologous structures in each of these organisms. And so that's really good evidence that humans, dogs, birds, and whales have all evolved from a common ancestor. Okay, and that's very interesting because whales are aquatic organisms where, humans and dogs live on land and birds fly. So all very, very different organisms, but again, we share a common ancestor. And again, that is based on comparative anatomy, looking at anatomical structures in these different organisms. And again, this term homologous, these are structures that have evolved from a common ancestor. Okay, what else can we find with comparative anatomy? This is really neat. We can find vestigial structures. So what is a vestigial structure? This is going to be a structure, whether it's an organ or a bone, that exists in an organism that doesn't have any apparent function in that particular species. However, if you look back at the evolutionary line of that organism, that particular structure did have a function in the ancestral organism. And so in the current, present day organism that we're looking at, it's considered vestigial, and it's a residual part. It used to have a function, but it no longer does. So in this example here, I'm not sure if you can see this whole thing. I'm going to move my slide over a little bit. This is an x-ray of a snake. I forget what kind of snake it is, boa constrictor or python, one of those. And if we look, so we've got a vertebral column and we've got ribs, we've got some bones coming off down here, and then we've got these things right here and right here. And those are remnants of hind leg bones. Now obviously snakes, boa constrictors, pythons, they don't require hind limbs because they're not walking at all. So why are those bones there? They just haven't been selected against. So in an evolutionary sense, natural selection hasn't gotten rid of them yet. There's no apparent function in this organism, but it's not doing any harm. And so again, it's not being selected against. I bet you could come up with a list of some human structures that might be vestigial. So go ahead and try that. However, if you look a lot of them up, so for example, a lot of students will say the appendix, right? It's a structure that's there. You could take it out, you could live without it. So it must be a vestigial structure. There's actually some current data that suggests that that's not true. Even though you can live without it, you actually might function better with it. The same idea with the gallbladder and spleen. Sometimes students will make that argument. So we have to be kind of careful with that. A residual part that you might think of is like your tailbone, right? Why is that there? We don't have tails anymore, right? But we actually do if we look back at how humans go through embryological stages, which I'm actually going to show you in a second. There is actually a post-anal tail that's there early on in development. So it's kind of interesting. So again, a vestigial structure is going to be a residual part that had a purpose in an ancestral form of that species, but again, no apparent function in the current modern day species. So why is it there? It just hasn't been selected against. But it does provide evidence for evolution, right? If those structures aren't being used, why are they there? So we can look back through evolutionary history and look at what we think might be an ancestral species. And if we find those bones had a purpose there, that's again going to present some evidence for evolution. Here's a couple of more examples of the same thing in whales. We also find hind leg bones, which again, whales are not walking, but that provides really good evidence that whales evolved from organisms that walked on land. Okay, same thing with snakes. So if we see those vestigial hind leg bones, again, we know that snakes evolved from organisms that did have hind legs, that did actually walk on all fours. Here's another one, wings on flightless birds, right? So penguins, ostrich, those are going to be birds that have wings, but those wings don't have any function. Why are they there? Well, again, in the ancestral form of the bird, they did have a function, and it just hasn't been selected against. So that's comparative anatomy. The next line of evidence, so we've got fossil record, we've got comparative anatomy. The next one is embryology. And so this line of evidence comes from studying the development of the anatomy of an organism to its adult form. So looking at all of the stages in embryonic development. And again, that shows evidence for evolution. These are studies that are done on vertebrate embryos, including humans. There have been studies done that have looked at a variety of different species of vertebrates. And if we look at embryonic stages of these different species of vertebrates, including humans, all vertebrate embryos have gill slits and a post-anal tail. So again, in humans, you might say, why are there gill slits there? We have lungs, right? We don't use gills to breathe like fish do. And why is there a post-anal tail? We don't have a tail. Those are things that are still there during early embryonic development. Obviously, gill slits are not present in our adult form or in the form that is actually born. It's only there during early embryonic form. And again, the post-anal tail, it's going to fade away, but we are left with a tailbone. Okay. So again, these structures are going to disappear in adult forms of terrestrial groups, including humans. However, if we look at aquatic organisms, so vertebrates that are aquatic, living in aquatic environments, those gill slits and post-anal tail are actually maintained in the adult form. And so that's really good evidence that humans and all other vertebrates are related to each other. So again, if we look at embryological studies, that's really good evidence of evolution. Okay, oh, this kind of got cut off too. So our next line of evidence is called biogeography. So I don't want to cut any part of this off. So biogeography, what is that? That is looking at the geographical distribution of species of organisms. And when we look at that, when we look at what kinds of organisms are found on what continents, it makes sense. Only if we understand the history of the planet. And so what we know is that about 200 million years ago, and before that, the Earth looked like this. And so it was all one big supercontinent, okay, called Pangaea. And that over time, so about 200 million years ago when this started to break up, we ended up getting separation of continents. And this is what the Earth looks like currently today, right? And of course, because of tectonic plate movement, these are still moving, okay? But this is what our planet looks like today. And so based on Earth's geological history, it makes sense that fossils of organisms that lived, right here would be found in both North America and in Africa. Okay? And organisms, in both North America and Africa may be very distantly related to each other. They've evolved in different habitats for a long time, but they might be very distantly related to each other. Okay, so again, that's the geographic distribution of both fossils or current day species. Again, that's going to make sense based on how the planet has changed geographically over time. So our last line of evidence for evolution is molecular biology. And generally speaking, this is a newer line of evidence. The fossil record and comparative anatomy and all of that has really been around for a while, but molecular biology is really relatively new. And so a couple of things I want to point out. Again, DNA is the universal genetic material. Okay, so again, if we look at bacteria all the way to humans, or we go back in evolutionary time, we look at organisms that are not around on the planet anymore, DNA has been universal. It's been the genetic material of all living organisms on the planet. When we look at DNA, when we look at the code, it's a universal code. Okay? And lastly, again, the cellular machinery for DNA replication, transcription, translation, they're all universal. And so that's really good evidence for evolution. We can look at organisms that are either currently alive on the planet today or that have gone extinct, but we still have DNA for them, and we can actually tell how closely or distantly related two organisms are based on genetic differences. So it's really, really pretty neat. We can also look at protein structure, and we can also look at how, again, closely or distantly related two organisms are based on protein structure. So a lot of new evidence is coming out with molecular biology, and a lot of the evolutionary trees that we have created before the advent of molecular biology most of them are being confirmed. Some of them are being changed based on this data. Misconceptions. So sometimes students will say, well, evolution is just a theory. Remember that a theory is the closest thing that we really have to fact in science. And scientists know that theories are not 100% foolproof, and that if new data comes out tomorrow that refutes part of a theory or a whole theory, we're willing to accept that. So evolution is not just a theory. It's backed up by mounds and mounds of evidence. The second thing is sometimes students will think that individuals evolve. You are not evolving right now. Populations evolve. So evolution happens at the level of populations. Evolution does not explain the origin of life. Nowhere in this presentation thus far did I tell you how life started on the planet. And basically, I don't have an answer for that. But once it did start, and it only started once, and that's what the theory of evolution says, that evolution started once on our planet, and that every organism alive today, or that has become extinct, evolved from that one beginning common ancestor. And so again, that one first organism, probably a cell, to arise on the planet, gave rise to all life on the planet from that point on. And the last misconception is that organisms evolve on purpose. They're trying to become more perfect. And that's not true, right? Organisms, populations of organisms, they're not driving their own evolution. Instead, the environment is selecting their evolution. The environment is driving that. Okay. So I want you to pause this video here, and I want you to answer the following "Are you with me?" questions. And then when you are finished, we shall go on.
Okay, so a couple of questions before you move on to the next section. Ooh. That's my alarm, sorry about that. Okay, so first question. Which is required for natural selection to take place? So what has to be present in order for natural selection to happen? Pink, uniformity of the population. Blue, variation among individuals in a population. Green, a large population, so a large population size. Or yellow, alternate food sources. I'll go ahead and let you think about that one for a minute, and then we'll come back. So hopefully you chose blue. Okay, so variation is required in order for natural selection to take place. So what is variation? It's genetic, heritable differences in a population. That is really what natural selection is going to act on. It's going to select for or against certain phenotypes that have a basis in genotype, right? Okay, next question. Polar bears are white to camouflage them from prey, so to hide them while they're feeding or about to feed. This is an example of, is this variation? Is this an example of adaptation or a vestigial structure or an example of a homologous structure? So hopefully you answered that white color of their fur is an adaptation, okay? Helping them to camouflage themselves from prey, helping them to feed better. Definitely going to be an evolutionary advantage and an adaptation for sure. It's going to increase their success in their particular environment, right? They're on that background of white, ice and snow. Okay, next question. The wings of insects, birds, pterosaurs, okay, you may have heard of those, and bats, all have the same function, flight, but they evolved independently from each other. This is an example of, is this divergent evolution, convergent evolution? Are these vestigial structures, or is this an example of variation in a population? And so hopefully you answered blue. This is an example of convergent evolution. Okay, these structures evolved independently of each other, but they have all evolved to have the same structure and the same function, flight. And so that's going to be convergent evolution. Next question. The most direct evidence of evolution comes from, does it come from the fossil record, or from the study of anatomy and embryology, or the study of the distribution of organisms on the planet, or biogeography, or from molecular biology? The most direct evidence of evolution. So hopefully you answered here the fossil record. That's the most direct evidence for evolution, where we can actually see and feel and touch sometimes the remnants, the remains of organisms that once lived. Okay, that's the most direct evidence. The other forms of evidence are still strong forms, but not as strong or as direct as the fossil record itself. Okay, a couple more questions. Oh no, I think that might be the last one. Yep, that's the last one. Okay, so go on to the next part, and after the next Are You With Me? I'll have some more questions for you.
Okay, so we're going to get into speciation now. And again, we're going to kind of just touch scrape the surface of this. It's really more in depth than what we're making it out to be. This is pretty cool. These are actually drawings from Darwin's original work on the origin of species, kind of showing how he thought organisms started off from one basic point, and then there was this branching mechanism. So evolution happened, and there was a common ancestor, and then again there was branching points where more different species evolved. So again, make sure we understand what a species is. A species is going to be a group of individuals living in a particular environment at the same time. and very importantly, that are capable of interbreeding. And when they interbreed, they are capable of producing viable, which means living, and fertile, which means offspring that can then go on and reproduce themselves. Okay? This is known as the biological species concept, which doesn't work for every organism on the planet, right? Because if you think about prokaryotes like bacteria or the archaea, they don't sexually reproduce. And so this definition doesn't make sense for them. There is another definition for species, but we're going to use this one. Again, it's called the biological species concept. And so when you have a population of a particular species, again, they're going to be living in the same region at the same time, and they're going to share a common, what we call gene pool. And that gene pool is going to be a collection of all of the alleles, all of the variants of all of the genes in that species. We're going to come back to this a lot in the next chapter, so keep that in the back of your mind. So what is speciation? This is when two species form from one original species. Okay, this is neat. This shows you the evolutionary history. It's kind of like a family tree of both the Asian and African elephant. Those are the two species that are alive presently on the planet. And if we look back through time, they diverged somewhere around here on this tree. And you can see that the mammoth is a pretty recent ancestor of both the African and Asian elephant. And it looks like coming before that, you've probably heard, maybe you've heard of the mastodon, so that would be back here. Stegodon, okay? A lot of these you probably haven't heard of. In any case, when we date back all the way down here, this is the common ancestor shared by everybody else on this tree. Okay? We're going to get into the mechanisms for speciation. How is it that new species arise from pre-existing species? And there's two main mechanisms that we'll talk about. They are called allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation. So we're going to do allopatric speciation first. And this is kind of the easier type of speciation to understand. It just makes more sense than sympatric speciation, although both do happen. So with allopatric speciation, what happens is you have a population of organisms that gets separated into two separate populations by some type of a geographical barrier. So you end up with kind of a parent species that separates into, we could say, maybe two daughter species. And again, there's some type of a geographical barrier, a mountain range, an ocean, a river, something physically separating these two subpopulations from each other. So again, you have a parent species made up of this population. Those two populations that make up that parent species, they get geographically isolated from each other. So what happens next? Well, if these two populations that are of the same species, if they don't interact with each other, then they don't reproduce. And so therefore, gene flow stops between these two populations. And so if we look at each individual population, they're only going to have a subset, a certain number of alleles from the gene pool of the original species, the parent species, the original population. Okay? And if they're isolated for a long enough period of time, evolution is going to occur in these two populations, differently. And so if these two populations ever came in contact with each other, again, they theoretically should not be able to reproduce. So again, here's some different ways that isolation can occur. Maybe there's a physical barrier, like a newly formed river or a newly formed mountain range. Or maybe a group of organisms journeys off from that original population and cannot get back. So they become geographically isolated in that manner. Okay, so maybe the mountain range already existed. You got a group of organisms that decides to go over the mountain range and they figure out they cannot get back for whatever reason. So now you've got a population here and you've got a population here, and they're no longer going to be mating, and so they're going to evolve differently. Here's another example. This is kind of neat. You can actually watch videos on YouTube of this, showing this. So you've got a flower. It's on, the mainland. Let's say it's on the South American mainland. We'll take it back to Darwin. And that particular flowering plant, it gets fertilized, and so it produces a seed, and that seed gets picked up by the wind, and it gets carried really, really high in the atmosphere, and it gets carried over the ocean, and it ends up landing on the Galapagos Island. And now that seed, or those seeds, probably a couple would go, or even if just one went, it would land, and if environmental conditions are great, that seed would grow. And a lot of flowering plants can actually self-fertilize, and so you can end up with offspring from that original plant. That would be the beginning of a new population. And again, this particular seed, especially if it's only one of them, it's only going to carry a subset of the alleles found in that original flowering population. And so therefore it's going to evolve differently than the organisms on the mainland. So allopatric means that there's some type of a geographic separation of a population from the original population. Okay, here's an example. So here's a real life example. We're on the North American continent, and you've got an owl population. Okay, and so we've got two now different species that were once the same species. So we've got this northern spotted owl, who again is on the northwest as well as into the Canadian border here. And so we've got this one particular species, which used to be the same species as the Mexican spotted owl, who's found here in North America as well as extending down here into Mexico. So again, these two used to be the same species, but for some reason they got geographically separated. So there's all this land here in between them, and they do not migrate from one area to the other for whatever reason. And so they're going to be in geographically separated locations. And if we look at the climate of those two geographic areas, the climate's going to be a little bit different, and the ecosystem is going to be a little bit different, the food source. And so therefore, the northern and Mexican spotted owls have evolved for some time now, distant from each other. And they've evolved in such a way that when we put those two back together, they don't reproduce. So again, there's a physical barrier. In this case, it's a lot of land in between them. Okay, here's another example. In this figure right here, these are the Hawaiian honey creepers. These are all different, kind of like the finches. A bunch of different birds, all are considered to be honey creepers, but they're all different species. And what you'll notice here is there's a little bit of a different morphology. And then if you look at the beak size and shape, it's also, just like the finches, been adapted for food source. So here's the example here. You've got a small population, in this case birds, right? It could have been the finches. A small population is going to migrate or is dispersed maybe by a storm or again picked up by the wind. And where that small population of organisms ends up, it can colonize that new area away from the new species. We're going to learn that that's called the founder effect, and we're going to actually see that again in the next chapter. So both the Galapagos finches, the Hawaiian honey creepers, both of those are examples of the founder effect. You see this on a lot of islands. So again, the Galapagos Islands, the Hawaiian Islands, both of those are island chains. And when we take a look at both of those, they provide geographic isolation. All of those different islands in that island chain are geographically separated from each other. And when you go on each of those islands, they have a slightly different ecology. And so that geographic isolation is perfect for allopatric speciation. You've got hundreds of unique species that are presently found on each Galapagos Island or each Hawaiian Island that are, again, all related to each other. They all have a common ancestor, but they've all evolved in different ecosystems. This is called adaptive radiation. This is when you have one parent species that goes to this new place, for example, this island chain, and it radiates or fulfills a bunch of different ecological niches because they're all available in this new habitat. Okay, it's called adaptive radiation. Okay, so allopatric speciation is really easy to understand. So you have a parent species, parent population, and some members, or maybe half of that parent population, get separated from the original parent population. And so therefore you end up with two populations of the same species. They get geographically isolated from each other, and over time, if you allow enough time, they can become genetically distinct and reproductively distinct. So if you put the two back together, they're not going to be able to reproduce, and that would make them two different species. Now, this other type of speciation is a little bit more difficult to understand. It's called sympatric speciation. Let me go back to allopatric speciation. Allopatric means different country, so living in two distinct regions, geographically isolated, where sympatric means same country. And so this is speciation that happens, right, the divergence of one population into two, that happens without a physical barrier. There's not a mountain, there's not a river separating two populations. So how does this happen? Well, there's a couple of different mechanisms, again, a little bit more difficult to understand than allopatric speciation. The first might be a change in ploidy. This is not common in animals, but it is really common in plants. So let's say that there's, meiosis takes place, which produces gametes, or spores in plants, which eventually develop into gametes. If there is a mistake in cell division, right, that leads to the production of gametes that don't have the right chromosome number, we're used to saying that those cells wouldn't make it, right? But in other species, especially some plant species, that's not true. A change in ploidy, a change in chromosome number, doesn't matter. So there's a mistake in cell division, there ends up being extra chromosomes, or too few chromosomes, and there's still going to be sexual reproduction. Well, now you have the production of a new organism that doesn't have the same chromosome number as the parent organism. Well, that could be the formation of an entirely new species. Okay? All right. How about one that involves an animal? So we'll take this example here, the fish. These are cichlid fish. They live in brackish water. They're from a lake called, I'm going to butcher this, Lake Apoyiqua. There, I tried. Lots of genetic evidence coming out that indicates that this particular lake was populated about 100 years ago by a single population of cichlid. So one single species of cichlid fish was put into this lake about 100 years ago. And since then, it's been found that there are two distinct populations, maybe even species, in that lake. There are the thin-lipped cichlids, and there are the thick-lipped cichlids. Okay, so two different, very distinct morphologies. And if you look at their lips, you can see the difference there. But you can also see a little bit of a difference on the dorsal fin. Okay, and there probably are some other morphological differences as well. So again, we have two populations that arose from a single species. And when we look at what they eat, they're going to be eating two distinct diets within this lake. And scientists believe that these two populations are in the early stages of speciation. Eventually, they will probably become reproductively isolated from each other, and they will be two distinct species. So again, there was no physical barrier put up. They're still living in the same lake, but for whatever reason, they started to, there was some genetic difference, and that led to two different distinct morphologies. Okay, so in any case, whether it's allopatric speciation or sympatric speciation, what happens is reproductive isolation. And so if you have two species, whether they're physically separated or not, if they don't mate with each other for enough time, then they can end up being two different species. Okay, their genotypes and their phenotypes will diverge along different lines, and they will not be able to reproduce with each other if they had the opportunity to do that. Okay, if they came in contact with each other. So reproductive isolation, the inability of two species that were once one to not be able to reproduce with each other. There's a couple of different mechanisms how this happens, and so that's what we're going to next. So you can see that some of these are pre-zygotic and some of these are going to be post-zygotic. Okay, so we'll start with the pre. So pre-zygotic barriers, these are barriers that are going to block reproduction from ever taking place. So again, you have two species that just diverged and they are going to be kept reproductively isolated from each other. And so pre-zygotic barriers will actually stop reproduction from taking place in the first place. And then post-zygotic barriers are a little bit more difficult to understand. What if reproduction happens and a zygote forms? Well, these are going to be barriers that are going to limit the success of the zygote. So we're going to talk about a bunch of both of these. So we got pre-zygotic and post-zygotic barriers. Both of them are going to block the formation of offspring. Okay, so the first type of pre-zygotic barrier that we'll talk about is temporal isolation. And so temporal means time. And so this is where you have two populations that were once one species that are separated from each other, in this case by time. So they breed at different times of the year or maybe at different times of the day. And so in this particular example, these are two frogs that are close relatives. We have the wood frog and we have the leopard frog, and they're actually living in the same environment, maybe not exactly the same habitats, but around in the same environment. And so if we look at mating, what keeps them reproductively isolated from each other is that their mating, their breeding times, even though they overlap a little bit, there's still a very distinct difference. So the wood frog is going to reproduce in early spring when water temperatures are a little bit chillier, and the leopard frog is going to wait for those water temperatures to warm up just a little bit, so they're going to reproduce a little bit later in spring. Again, there is some overlap, but again, we do see these are two distinct species. Okay, again, they're isolated by the time of the year in this case that they reproduce. So there's time. Habitat isolation. So you have a population of a species, right? You have one parent population, and a section, part of that parent population is going to move to a new habitat within the same region. Okay, and so here's an example here. These are two different types of grasshoppers. They were of the same species. They're evolving, right? And so they're becoming two different species. They are two different species. And so why do they not reproduce with each other? Well, because of habitat isolation. Okay, so they were of the same species, but now they're not. And so this guy over here, belonging to this genus and species, Gorillus firmus, prefers this soil, loamy soil. And this guy over here prefers more sandy soil. Okay, so they prefer different habitats within the same ecological region. And so that prevents them from reproducing. So temporal would be time, habitat would be different habitats in the same region. Here's a really neat one. It's one of my favorite pictures. So this is behavioral isolation. So again, you have the presence or absence of a specific behavior is going to prevent two organisms from closely related species that not too long ago separated from each other. This is going to prevent them from reproducing in nature. So behavioral isolation. Before I get to the bowerbird, let me tell you about fireflies. So there's actually multiple species of fireflies. And so how do these fireflies know who to mate with? And so it turns out that male fireflies are going to use species-specific light patterns to attract female flies of the same species. And so these female flies know the light pattern that male flies of their species use. And so when they see a different light pattern, they think, well, that's not attractive. I'm not going to go towards that fly. That's weird. Okay, so it's going to be very, very specific. You've probably also heard of, certain birds do certain types of calls. Okay, and so a cardinal is not going to be attracted to the call of a bluebird. Okay, it's just not going to happen. That's behavioral isolation. Here's another example, and this is a great example. This guy right here is called the bowerbird, and he's a male. And very interestingly, in birds and in insects, it's the male fly that has to entice or attract the female fly. Kind of neat. And so the bowerbird here in this example is literally decorating his nest. And what he's doing as he's decorating the nest is he's trying to make it as colorful as possible to attract, to show that he's very fit to attract females to his nest to mate with. He will also do a certain type of a call and a dance that will help to attract those as well. And so here in this figure, this bowerbird likes blue, and so he's picking up anything blue in his environment, whether it's a feather or, unfortunately, we got garbage here, so bottle caps, and he's just going to decorate the entrance here to his nest in hopes that a female bird will come by and think that it looks nice. So again, that's behavioral isolation. Other birds that are not of his species are going to come by and say, what the heck is this crazy bird doing? Why is he putting all this stuff on his nest for? They're not going to understand that. So that keeps different species from mating. It's behavioral isolation. Mechanical isolation. These are structural differences in reproductive organs that prevent successful mating. So literally the pieces don't fit. Here's an example of two different species of flowers. So this is the foxglove flower, and here is the trumpet creeper flower. And if we look at the anatomy of the flower, they have different openings, and the reproductive structures are going to be at different lengths within the flower. And so the foxglove flower is going to be big enough for the honeybee to get right in there and to grab what it needs and at the same time pick up pollen. And this particular trumpet creeper flower is going to be pollinated by the hummingbird. And so the hummingbird's beak is going to be perfect for getting right in there, extracting nectar and again picking up pollen as it does so. And so flowers are going to have different sized flowers, different colored petals. Their reproductive structures will have a different morphology, and that's all going to be specific to the pollinator. Okay, which is the organism that helps in mating. So flowers rely on pollinating insects or birds to carry pollen from one flower to the next. Okay. The last type of prezygotic barrier is gametic isolation. Okay, so let's say mating takes place between two organisms that are not of the same species, that are closely related but not of the same species. So what can happen is there is going to be molecular or chemical differences between the species on the gametes that prevents fertilization. Okay, so for example, and this happens a lot in organisms, aquatic organisms that release egg and sperm right into the water. So you have egg of one species and let's say sperm of a separate species. The sperm of that separate species will not be able to penetrate the egg. It will not be able to bind to the surface of the egg, nor will it be able to gain entry into the egg because there are molecular differences on those gametes that prevent that combination. Okay. So the surface of the egg in this case is going to have very specific proteins that will only bind to the complementary molecules on the outside of the sperm cells of the same species. If it's a different species, they just won't bind. Okay, so all of those were prezygotic barriers, so before fertilization takes place. Okay, so what happens if fertilization does take place? Well, there are even post-zygotic barriers. So what are these? This is, okay, so the fertilization has taken place, you have a zygote. Okay, that zygote, if it makes it, it's going to be a hybrid. It's the product of two different species, two different distinct but closely related species. And so one of two things can happen. That zygote can die. That's called a hybrid inviability. Okay, this is when the hybrid dies in an early embryonic stage. Or we could end up with hybrid sterility. So the zygote lives, it goes through embryonic stages, it's born, it's viable, it's alive, and it'll live, maybe for a while, but it cannot reproduce. And so here's an example here. Let me try to get this right. So here's the horse, and here's a mule. No, here's the horse, and here's the donkey. I always say this wrong. They mate to produce a mule. Yeah, the mule. And the mule is going to live, but it's going to be sterile. So it's not going to be able to reproduce itself. And so the lineage ends here. There's other examples that you can read about. For example, the liger, you've probably heard of that. That's a cross between a tiger and a lion. And so the liger lives, but it's also going to be sterile. Okay, so there's other examples of that. That's called a post-zygotic barrier. So the zygote forms, but it either doesn't live or it lives, but it can't reproduce. Okay, so I want you to take a break here and I want you to answer these questions. And then when you're done, you can continue. We just have a little bit left.
A couple of questions for you before you move on. Maybe? Yeah, okay. So just a couple questions. So first one, members of the same species, are they genetically identical? Can they breed and produce viable, fertile offspring? Green, can they evolve individually? Or yellow, they can evolve from different ancestral species. So which one makes sense there for members of the same species? So hopefully you answered blue. Let's look at these a little bit. So red, they are genetically identical, not 100%. No, members of the same species definitely have genetic variability that comes out in variation of the species. We don't all, we're not all identical on the inside or the outside, right? And that's all dictated by our genes, so we are not genetically identical. Green here can evolve individually. No, individuals of a species do not evolve independently. Instead, populations evolve. Okay, so there's a difference there. Individual organisms do not evolve. Remember that misconception? Instead, populations evolve. And yellow doesn't make any sense. Members of the same species wouldn't evolve from separate ancestral species, right? They wouldn't end up being the same species. That doesn't make sense. And so blue, that one makes sense. So members of the same species are capable of breeding, okay, in nature, and producing viable, which means to be alive, so living, and fertile means that they can then reproduce themselves, okay? So they can breed and produce fertile, viable offspring. Okay, next question. Speciation in which there is a geographic separation is called, so a geographic separation, is that called allopatric speciation, sympatric speciation, adaptive speciation, or dispersive speciation? So again, speciation where there is a geographic separation. That's going to be allopatric. Remember, different country. So allopatric. Anytime that there is a geographic separation, whether it's a mountain range or a river or an ocean, any type of physical barrier that keeps two populations of the same species separated, okay? That's going to lead to speciation. That's going to lead to those two populations evolving along different lines, right? Evolving in different ways because they're geographically separated from each other. They're not mating, okay? Remember that sympatric means same country. That's still speciation, but there's not a geographic or physical barrier separating two populations of the species. And the other two we didn't talk about. Okay, so pardon my children upstairs. Okay. The American toad and Fowler's toad are found in overlapping geographic ranges in the United States and Canada. So that means that these two frogs are found in the same regions, okay? They are closely related, but they do not mate in the wild because the American toad mates in early summer, while the Fowler's toad mates in late summer. This is an example of, is this behavioral isolation, temporal isolation, mechanical, or habitat isolation? So hopefully you answered temporal isolation because they're mating at different times here of the year, of the summer. And this, of course, is a pre-zygotic barrier, right? It's a barrier that prevents the zygote from being formed. In fact, these will not even mate. However, the toads, they're pretty closely related in the laboratory if we set up mating, not in the wild. And so if we kind of cued it so that they were going to reproduce at the same time, we might get reproduction. We might end up with a hybrid. Okay, but in nature, the American toad is only going to mate in early summer, and the Fowler's toad mates in late summer. And so even though they're located in the same place, they're not going to reproduce with each other. So they're going to stay as separate species. So again, that's a pre-zygotic barrier, and that would be temporal time. Here's another question. In the video about the Grants, remember Peter and Rosemary Grant, the video that hopefully you paused and watched, and their study of the Galapagos finch, they found, among other things, that species of finch were reproductively isolated based on mating call and mating dance. Okay, this is an example of behavioral isolation, temporal isolation, mechanical isolation, or habitat isolation. So hopefully you picked red or pink, whatever that is, behavioral isolation. So remember, mating call and mating dance, those are both behaviors. Just like the bowerbird decorating his nest with all the blue stuff. That's a behavior that's going to keep species separated. Okay, and so you're going to move on to the very last part of the lecture. And so there will be one more Are You With Me and one more set of questions.
Okay, so after speciation occurs, so you have, again, one parent species that splits into two species that are reproductively isolated from each other. Sometimes those two closely related species can reconnect, and that might just happen once, or they may continue to interact indefinitely if they end up sharing the same ecosystem. And so regions where that happens are called hybrid zones. These are regions where these two newly formed species end up coming back into contact with each other, and they end up reproducing with each other. And so the offspring here of these two new species would be hybrids. And so hybrids, it depends. If they're unfit, then they're not going to be fertile. And so there's going to be a reinforcement of that speciation. But if reproductive barriers weaken, then fusion might happen where those two species might actually end up becoming one once again. Okay, so that happens as well. There are two models to explain the rate of speciation. And I'm going to tell you about both models, and I need you to know that both are correct. And it depends on the environmental factors that are at play. And so again, these two models, even though they are distinct, they both have been shown to occur throughout evolutionary history. So the first one at the top is called gradual speciation. Okay? Or some people refer to this as graduated speciation, same thing. This is when species evolve and diverge gradually over time with small changes to the species over time. So small increments, small steps. Where punctuated equilibrium is the opposite. So what this model says is that new species undergo really quick changes from the parent species and remains unchanged then for a long time. So evolution is punctuated throughout evolutionary history. Big change happens, and then we have stasis for a while. And then a big change happens, and then we have stasis for a while. And again, both models are correct. Here's just a picture showing both of those. So up at the top here, this would be gradual speciation. So this is the original species, the founder. And this species diverges into two different species. And then both of these species evolve independently of each other over time. So we've got gradual changes. You can see the beak size is really changing here. And the same thing would happen to this species over here. Okay, and this would be the current day species here present. At the bottom here, this represents punctuated equilibrium. So instead of happening gradually over time, in punctuated equilibrium, we have one parent species, gives rise to two different species. And then there's a big period of stasis, no change, and then all of a sudden a big change. And this would be the new species that would arise. And the same thing down here. We have this species, a lot of time goes by without any changes, and then boom, punctuated a big evolutionary change, in this case again in beak size morphology. Okay, so gradual, small changes over time in small increments, and this would be punctuated. Large evolutionary changes separated by long periods of stasis, of no change. And again, both are correct. Depends on what organism we're looking at. Different organisms evolve differently. Some have evolved, in a punctuated fashion, and some have evolved in a gradual fashion. It depends on the environment that the species is evolving in. So here's your last Are You With Me? So you want to answer these last two questions, and then you can upload the Are You With Me's for Chapter 18 right onto Blackboard.
Before you do that, just answer these last couple of questions with me. Just got two for you. So the first one, which term is used to describe the continual divergence of a species based on the low fitness of hybrid offspring? Okay, so you have hybrid zones, you have hybrid offspring. These offspring are of low fitness, and so what's going to happen? Is it going to be reinforcement, fusion, stability, or punctuated equilibrium? And so hopefully you answered reinforcement, right? There's going to be that continual divergence of the species. Last question. Which components of speciation would be least likely to be part of punctuated equilibrium? Okay, so which components of speciation least likely to be part of punctuated equilibrium? So you have a population and it divides. Would that lead to punctuated equilibrium? Can it lead to punctuated equilibrium? Or a sudden change in environmental conditions? Would that lead to punctuated equilibrium, or could it? Green says ongoing gene flow among individuals. So nothing's really happened here. We have individuals of a population and they are still randomly mating. Okay. And then lastly, in yellow, we have a large number of mutations that take place all at once. Okay, so which of these is least likely to be part of punctuated equilibrium? So hopefully you answered green here. The rest of these could lead to punctuated equilibrium, sudden changes in that population that lead to major evolutionary events. All of those could be, except for green. Green would be a great example of gradual evolution, gradual evolution throughout time. There's no major events that happen to a population that would cause that punctuated equilibrium to occur. Okay, so again, the least likely would be ongoing gene flow among all individuals. Okay, so that is the end of the presentation. So remember again that you're going to want to upload your Are You With Me's right to Blackboard. Make sure you study everything, and then you can go ahead and you can take that quiz.